Imagine a literal professor trying to humiliate a student, only to discover she's up against a 195 IQ genius. Baron James Trump. What happens next will leave you speechless. Baron's intellect is tested in front of his entire class, but what they don't expect is his ability to shatter their assumptions. Can Baron prove that his brilliance goes far beyond his last name? Keep reading to see how this unforgettable challenge unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to inspire others with this story. The crisp afternoon air seeped into the ivy-clad halls of Yale University, where the imposing architecture echoed the intellectual legacy the institution carried. Inside the vast lecture hall, rows of desks were filled with final-year mathematics students, their pens poised and notebooks open, ready for their most challenging subject yet: advanced calculus. The atmosphere was a blend of eager anticipation and quiet anxiety, as every student in the room knew that today's seminar would push their minds to the limit. High above, the soaring ceilings amplified the murmur of voices and the occasional shuffle of papers. Students, all in their crisp attire, glanced nervously at the front of the room. The cold stone walls and rows of wooden desks seemed to shrink the space, focusing the room's attention on the figure standing at the front. Professor Melinda Gabriel, tall and commanding, stood with her arms crossed. Her sharp, calculating eyes swept across the room like a hawk, making each student feel as though they were being measured under the weight of her gaze. She wore a sleek, tailored suit that framed her stern figure, with a vibrant red scarf draped elegantly around her neck, a bold statement that mirrored her unyielding personality. Her glasses sat perched on the bridge of her nose, and her expression was unreadable. A woman of both intellect and influence, Professor Gabriel was known for her biting criticisms and high standards, particularly towards students who, in her opinion, did not meet her expectations. Her political views were as sharp as her mathematical mind, and she wielded them with authority, often pushing boundaries in her teaching as much as in her public life. At the back of the room, Baron James Trump sat, quiet and unassuming. A young man of 22 with striking, sharp features, he had a calm demeanor that betrayed little emotion. The weight of his last name was often a burden, and the shadows of his father's political fame loomed large over him. But Baron had worked hard to carve out a space for himself. Far removed from the public eye, he had built his reputation as an intellectual force. His IQ of 195 was an unspoken fact, something the other students only quietly acknowledged, though they could never truly fathom the depth of his mind. Baron wasn't here for recognition or to bask in the glow of his father's name. He was here for one reason: to finish his degree in mathematics. His attire, a simple dark blue blazer, a crisp white shirt, and black pants, was understated, a stark contrast to the usual political fanfare associated with his family. In the classroom, Baron was just another student. He was calm, confident, and determined, his quiet nature often misread as indifference. But underneath he carried a quiet fire, one that would never show itself until it was called upon. As the students waited for Professor Gabriel to begin, Baron remained seated at the back, hoping to blend into the background. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. His focus was on the task at hand: mastering his studies and finishing his final year. But that wouldn't be the case today. Professor Gabriel, as if sensing Baron's attempt at anonymity, had already decided that he would be her target. Professor Gabriel's voice, smooth and clipped, cut through the room, drawing every student's attention. "Today, we're going to see who can truly handle the challenges that lie ahead," she said, her words dripping with sarcasm. "The future leaders of this world will need to prove their worth, and what better way than by solving a real mathematical problem? I'll pick someone to step up." "Baron," she said, her eyes locking onto him, "how about you? Let's see if you're as brilliant as they say." A collective silence descended on the room. Baron's classmates exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. They had all witnessed the tension between Professor Gabriel and Baron in the past. The professor's disdain for Baron's background was no secret, and her political views often shaped her interactions with him. Barron's last name, which connected him to the upper echelons of American politics, made him an easy target for Gabriel's scorn. This challenge wasn't about Barron's academic abilities. It was about something far more personal, about humiliating him in front of the class, about proving her superiority over a student she believed didn't belong in a place like Yale. The room grew quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Barron didn't react immediately. He didn't show any signs of anger or frustration. Instead, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. The class watched him, each student holding their breath as he made his way to the front of the room. There was no defiance in his step, only a quiet certainty. He was used to being underestimated, and this moment was no different. He had nothing to prove to anyone but himself. Professor Gabriel's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile as she wrote a complex multivariable calculus problem on the board. It was a puzzle so intricate that even the brightest minds in the room would struggle to solve it, especially under the pressure of an audience. Her eyes flicked to Barron as she turned back to face the class, waiting for him to falter. Barron stood before the board, his gaze fixed on the equations. The problem was daunting. Its many variables and complex relationships were enough to cause even the most accomplished mathematicians to hesitate. But Barron, though only a student, saw the problem for what it was, another challenge to be solved, not a test to be failed. He took a breath, pushed aside the noise in his mind, and began to work. As his chalk made contact with the board, the room grew even quieter. Barron began to work through the equations with a fluidity and precision that was mesmerizing. His mind moved quickly, processing the variables and the intricacies of the problem with astonishing ease. He wrote, paused, and wrote again, each stroke of chalk bringing him closer to a solution that no one in the room had expected. His movements were confident, methodical, and steady, as though solving complex multivariable calculus problems was second nature to him. Meanwhile, Professor Gabriel's expression grew more and more hardened. Her eyes were narrowed as she watched Barron's every move, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. She was waiting for him to slip up, waiting for the moment when his confidence would crumble and the truth would be revealed. A student like Barron, with his political ties and privileged background, could never truly grasp the depths of mathematics in the way that others, those without connections, could. He had to be relying on his name, on his status. There was no way this could be real. But Barron did not falter. The smirk that had crept across Professor Gabriel's face began to fade as Barron continued solving the problem. With each step, he was not just solving the equation. He was revealing the depth of his understanding. The clarity with which he worked, the ease with which he navigated the complexity, left no room for doubt. His brilliance was undeniable, even to those who had doubted him. The room, once heavy with skepticism, now buzzed with quiet surprise. As Barron neared the final step of the equation, the tension in the room seemed to peak. The problem, which had once seemed so unapproachable, was slowly being broken down into manageable steps. But just as Barron was about to complete the last part, Professor Gabriel's voice rang out, sharp and piercing. "You think this is enough?" she challenged, her tone dripping with disdain. "Can you really solve this? You're just relying on your name, Barron. I don't believe you can actually grasp this kind of work." The room fell silent. Every student in the class held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The challenge had now escalated from an academic exercise to a personal confrontation. Barron stood there, his chalk frozen in midair as the words hit him. But Barron did not flinch. His eyes met Professor Gabriel's, unwavering. His voice, when it came, was calm and steady, without a hint of defensiveness. "It's not about my name, Professor. It's about the work," he said simply. There was no arrogance in his words, just quiet confidence in the truth of what he was saying. With that, he turned back to the board, his hand moving with precision as he completed the final step. The chalk danced across the board, and as he wrote the last equation, the solution was clear. With a fluid motion, Barron stepped back, presenting the answer with a grace that took everyone by surprise. It was elegant, clean, and precise, everything the problem had demanded. The room was deathly silent for a moment. And then, almost as if the air had been released from a balloon, it exploded into a collective gasp. Barron had done it. He had solved the problem in front of the entire class, not just without error, but with a depth of understanding that left even the harshest critics speechless. Professor Gabriel's face, once full of disbelief, was now frozen in stunned silence. She had been proven wrong, her expectations shattered in the face of Barron's quiet genius. The students in the room, once unsure of Barron's abilities, were now looking at him with a new sense of respect and awe. Barron had not just solved a math problem. He had turned the tables on an entire room of doubters, proving that intellect, not status, was what truly mattered. The room crackled with an energy so electric, it was almost tangible. The air felt charged as if the very walls of the lecture hall had absorbed the collective disbelief and awe of everyone present. Prof. Gabriel, once so sure of herself, stood frozen at the front of the class, her sharp gaze still fixed on the chalkboard. Her face had shifted dramatically, her earlier suspicion now replaced by something else entirely: shock. Barron's solution, so elegantly and effortlessly completed, sat there on the board in front of her. It was a thing of beauty, a display of mathematical brilliance that few could match. The silence in the room stretched on, feeling like an eternity. Barron, standing calm and composed, his hands loosely at his sides, didn't look at anyone. His focus remained on the chalkboard, but his mind was at peace. He knew what he had done, and he knew the truth of what had just transpired. It wasn't just the solution that had stunned the class. It was the sheer magnitude of what he had proven, not just to them, but to himself. The other students, once tentative and unsure, were now captivated. Their eyes were wide with amazement, their whispers soft, as if they couldn't believe the transformation unfolding before them. Barron, the quiet student who had been underestimated, had just shattered every assumption they had about him. They had seen glimpses of his talent before, but nothing like this. This was pure, unfiltered brilliance, laid out in front of them, unassailable and undeniable. Finally, after what felt like a long, heavy pause, Prof. Gabriel broke the silence. Her voice, when it came, was softer than Barron had ever heard it before. The biting edge of her earlier comments was gone, replaced by something that almost sounded like admiration. "I was wrong," she said, her words slow, almost reluctant. "You're right. Your name has nothing to do with this. It's all you. I didn't see it before, but I see it now." Barron didn't move. He didn't bask in the moment or revel in his victory. He simply stood there, calm and collected. His eyes met hers, and he replied with a voice that was steady but firm, a reflection of his quiet confidence. "It's not about being seen or being judged, Professor. It's about using what we have, regardless of our background, to reach higher. And that includes you, Professor. Political views aside, we all have the potential to grow. But we must stop assuming others can't." The weight of Barron's words lingered in the room, hanging in the air like a subtle challenge. The students, once unsure of where they stood in this intellectual battle, now saw Barron for who he truly was, a man who had risen above judgment and prejudice. He had not only solved an impossible problem, but he had done so with grace, humility, and an unwavering belief in the power of intellect, no matter the background. The moment, though filled with intensity, also felt oddly liberating. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about breaking down the walls of assumption and bias that so often defined academic spaces. Barron had not just proven his academic prowess. He had demonstrated the power of perspective, the importance of seeing potential in everyone, regardless of their identity or background. As the class began to settle down, the atmosphere shifted once again, this time from awe to something more grounded: respect. Prof. Gabriel, standing silently at the front, seemed to be processing everything she had just witnessed. Her role as a professor, her political views, her judgments, they all seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a deep and genuine acknowledgment of Barron's ability and potential. The class ended with a sense of closure, but the ripple effects of what had transpired would linger long after the final bell rang. As Barron gathered his things, his classmates began to approach him one by one, their expressions now full of admiration and curiosity. It was a silent acknowledgment, but it was enough to prove that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of him. The day of graduation arrived, a warm spring morning filled with the promise of new beginnings. Baron James Trump stood tall in his cap and gown, the fabric of his robe flowing around him as he clutched his diploma in one hand. His face, calm and composed, reflected the quiet pride that had carried him through his journey. He had faced doubt, prejudice, and a challenge that had been meant to break him. But now, here he stood, having overcome it all. The applause around him was loud, but to Barron, it was a soft, steady reminder that he had proven something far more important than academic success. As he looked around the grand hall, his eyes briefly landed on Professor Gabriel, standing at the back of the room. The woman who had once scorned him, challenged him, and tried to humiliate him, now stood quietly, a distant figure. Her gaze met his, and in that brief moment, Barron saw something different in her expression, something like respect. Though her political views hadn't shifted, she could no longer deny the impact he had made. Barron had shown her that intellect wasn't something you could judge based on a name or background. It was earned through hard work and determination. Barron's footsteps echoed through the hall as he moved forward, the crowd parting to make way for him. As he crossed the stage, a surprise awaited him, one that no one could have anticipated. The university's vice-chancellor, a man who had silently observed the entire ordeal, stood at the edge of the stage, waiting for Barron. He extended his hand, his expression warm but serious. "Barron," he said, his voice clear and confident, "I've been following your journey throughout your time here at Yale, and I've seen the kind of brilliance you possess. It is with great pleasure that I offer you a position in our advanced mathematics program. Your potential is limitless, and we are honored to have you continue your studies with us." The room fell into a stunned silence. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Barron, not one to show much emotion, allowed a small smile to play on his lips as he shook the vice-chancellor's hand. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Barron's thoughts were already moving forward. This was just the beginning. He had always known it. His journey wasn't about a singular victory. It was about the road ahead and the opportunities yet to come. But the surprises weren't over. Just as Barron was about to step away from the podium, the announcement everyone had been waiting for came. The head of the ceremony cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone. "And now, it is with great excitement that we announce the new Vice-Chancellor of Yale University, Professor Melinda Gabriel." The room went silent, then erupted into surprised applause. Barron's eyes widened as he looked toward the back of the room. Professor Gabriel, once the antagonist of his story, stood at the back, her face a mix of surprise and quiet triumph. She had risen to a position of power, a testament to the change in perspective she had undergone over the course of their interactions. It was an ironic twist, and Barron couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. The woman who had once tried to undermine him was now in a position where she could make a real difference. The full circle of their journey was clear. Through their conflict, they had both grown. Barron stood proudly as the final moments of the ceremony played out. His heart swelled with pride, not because he had defeated anyone, but because he had stayed true to himself, never allowing others to define his potential. He had shown that intellectual capability knows no bounds, that judgment based on background or last names only served to limit those who held such biases. Thank you for watching. Endeavor to like, subscribe, and share to inspire someone today.